Who likes a good old-fashioned thunderstorm? Yeah, there are some of us that like those and some of us that are terrified by those including my dogs. But good old-fashioned thunderstorm is awesome, isn't it? We had some thunder rolling last night. According to my rain gauge, we got over an inch in my backyard, at least. I don't know how that compares to yours. And an inch that we truly needed. But there's just something about being in the midst of hearing that thunder roll all around you, how awesome it is. And it can be scary if you're in the wrong place, like a tent in a state park campground. But other than that, if you're in a safe place, hearing the thunder and seeing the lightning and a big old thunderhead cloud rising in the distance, it's awesome stuff. I was thinking about being in a storm this past week. We weren't in a storm, but I was remembering because Jennifer and Ada and I went to Iowa, dinked around on the old family farm a little bit, got sore. But anyway, as we're driving around on the nearby gravel roads out there in rural Boone County, you know how some memories, they're just burned into your brain, and when you're back in the place where it happened, it comes back. Remember that? And you ever been in a situation like that? We're driving down this gravel country road just north of where the old farmhouse is, and one of those memories came back to me, and there was a storm. Now, I'm not going to tell you the whole story because I've used the story I don't know how many times. But back in the summer of 76, in fact, it was June of 76. What's the math? How many years ago is that? Yeah, right. It was. So however many years ago that was, June of 76, there was an F5 tornado that ripped through rural Boone County and blew apart our farm. Now, in my dad's wisdom at the time, because he wanted to save the car, we all got in the car to drive away from an F5 tornado, okay? So I was hiding in the basement, because that's what they tell you in school to do. I'm in the basement, and then somebody comes and gets me. Thankfully, they came and got me. And we all got in the car, because Dad wanted to save the car. And we drive north to the next gravel road. Anyway, I'll shorten it up. We're headed west. We're westbound in the old Ford something 500. Can't remember the name of it. Now it escaped me. Galaxy. Thank you. Ford Galaxy 500, four-door, hardtop, basic family car, nothing fancy about it. We're driving westbound. I look to my left. I'm a 7-year-old, and I see the barn blow up. And I'll never forget. It's just like that scene out of The Wizard of Oz where they see the tornado coming. It's very similar to that because I could see that sucker turning and the mud in the fields flying and hay and whatever that blew up out of the barn goes airborne. And in my 7-year-old mind, I'm thinking, we're going to die. It's a half mile away, right? And to make it even more terrifying, in the midst of that storm, because you're kind of in the eye of the storm at this point, the hail and the rain has stopped, and you're in the midst of this massive tornado, it cuts across the field and then turns and starts coming at us. So remember, we're westbound. All of a sudden, that thing is eastbound directly at us. So I'm really thinking, we're going to die. And we pull in, Dad pulls into this little entrance to a field. It happened to be right there, fortunately. Pull in, turn around. He peels out the other direction, manages to keep the car on the gravel. It's the fastest my dad ever drove in his life. And we get out of there, and we were safe. Now, that's one storm I do not want to duplicate. I don't want to go through that one again. It matters. Here's where I'm going with this, okay? Whether it was a thunderstorm last night or going through something that could be catastrophic. It matters if there is a refuge in view, a place of asylum, a place of safety that you can get to in time, not just to not get wet or for your car to not get hail damage, but to save your life. That matters, does it not? That changes everything if you know there is a possibility I can get to safety on time. This morning's passage is all about finding that refuge, that getting to a safe place in time to save your life. And that is in the book of Joshua, chapter 20. And I need to do a little context here. to build us to that point. So last week we talked about a larger section of the book of Joshua, and the section that we're currently in goes from chapter 13 to chapter 21. It's talking about the inheritance, the allotments, okay? So all these different tribes of Israel, they've entered into the promised land, and now Joshua is divvying up the land, basically, assigning different portions of the promised land to different tribes. So, or in addition to the tribes, to some individuals like Caleb that we talked to last week, and Joshua, they received their place in the promised land. One big question that we should have as we read the text is they are spread apart now, or are about to be spread apart over hundreds of miles in this new land, this new place to call home. What will it be that will keep them as a unified whole, even though they're spread apart? Which is a really good question to ask. There's one tabernacle, there's one place to worship, there is one center of religion and sacrifice and worship, and now they're going to be spread apart all over the place. So what will keep them unified, one people group under the same set of laws that were first given to Moses and then handed to Joshua? What is going to bring them and to continue to bring them together is the big question. Now, the law has already been handed down. We have the book of Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus, and then the summary of many of those laws in the book of Deuteronomy. First 5 books are the Torah, they are the law, the teachings. So they already have what God has given them. But what we have here at the end of all this allotment and inheritance is the review of one of those laws, one of those statutes. So that, in particular, is interesting. The writer of the book of Joshua doesn't choose to inform us or review all of those laws. There's no point in it. It already exists. But there's one that is very significant for us, for the people in ancient times, and that's why we have chapter 20. So, it's a shorter chapter. We're going to read the whole thing in just a few moments, but we need to understand how it connects with the tribes, why it is so important right now, the value of it that goes beyond just another civil thing you're supposed to do, okay? Another statute, another law that governs society, so to speak. So, this morning we're going to try to quickly examine all those things and then bridge from the original Testament, why does it matter to them, so that we can bridge to why does this matter to us? What is it here that is of value to us today? So, the cities of refuge and the blood redeemer. That's the title of the sermon. It almost sounds like a novel. It almost sounds like a Harry Potter book. So we're not going to go there. It's not a Harry Potter book. But it has everything that what we're looking at this morning in this chapter has everything to do with cities of refuge and what's going on in the background, what we're calling the blood redeemer. So the first point, the first thing we're going to investigate here is how and why the Old Testament law, the original Testament law, is established, what that has to do with chapter 20, okay? So every tribe has its place. Book of Joshua has already laid that out. We haven't taken the time to read all of that, but from chapter 13 up to where we're at, all of this, the boundaries, the location, all of that is there. Everybody, every tribe gets a place in the land except for Levi. Levi's tribe doesn't get an allotment. In Joshua chapter 18, verse 7, we're told that the priesthood is their inheritance. So there's more to that backstory that we're not going to delve into this morning, but just know this. They don't have like a state in the country. They're not given that. But they are given a number of different cities. In fact, they're given 48 cities in the promised land, and they are spread throughout the promised land. In addition to that, the Levites, their inheritance is the priesthood, so they are dedicated to the care of the tabernacle. Okay? So some of them are going to have to live encamped, whatever, near wherever the tabernacle is. But in addition to that, they need to be spread out throughout the land. Why is that so important? Here's why. They, as priests, are connected. They're the go-between, if you can say it like that, between the Lord God, Yahweh, and his people, the children of Israel. The priests, their role in the original testament is to intercede between God and man when it comes to the practices of worship and the festivals and the sacrifices at the tabernacle. So they need to be spread out among the tribes, not just to ensure civil order. That's important. They're all spread out. What is going to keep this from turning into the Wild West, right? Where everybody does their own thing, everybody does what's right in their own eyes, which, spoiler alert, that's what happens anyway. But what could keep that from happening is the Levites doing their job, people responding to them, but there is more at stake here than just simply trying to enforce civil order, reward, and punishment, and so forth. The law, all the content of those first 5 books of the original testament, all of that is established to what? Not just keep law and order, not just to tell you what to do and what not to do. It's established so that the people will have an idea of the character and the nature of God himself. Why is that important? Because God has always been a personal God. Now, there is, in a sense, some distance because the tabernacle and the holiness of God, that changes when Christ comes. But he's always been a personal God, connected personally to his people. So the Levites, their role is not just to remind people, but to keep people connected to the character and the nature and the person of God, because God wants to do that with his people. You follow me so far? That's why it's so important for the Levites to be spread out everywhere to ensure that that relationship, that bond, continues to exist. From generation to generation, the people know of God and how he does things and what he requires of his people. The Levite priesthood plays an essential part or role in that connection. So, I already mentioned 48 cities are given to the Levites. So all these details are in Numbers chapter 35. We're not going to dig into all those details, but if you want to review, make sure I did everything right and I said I didn't goof anything up, go back to Numbers chapter 35 and you can get the specifics and the details of that. Joshua says, by name, there are 48 cities that are given to the Levites that are spread out all over the place. 6 of those cities are what we're calling, what Scripture calls, the cities of refuge. So, this is where, well, not just this point, but especially this point in chapter 20, the role of Israel in the world is set apart. Not only are there civil, social rules, there's ethical standards. Pretty much every nation state, every kingdom, everybody had those. But Israel's role as a society of their place in the world stands apart. And that is by design, because God wants not only his people, the children of Israel, to know him. God's intent, all the way back to Abraham, God's intent has always been to use his people as a light to the Gentiles. Always. And so sadly, that is always forgotten. And we see that over and over, time and again throughout the original Testament. In the history of the people of Israel, they lost track of that. But that's what God's desire, that's what God's heart is, for the world to know him and to use Israel in that role so people can see and understand how God, the living God, is truly unique, different, stands apart from every other idol, every other system of belief. God is unique and special compared to all of them. So, we're on to those 6 cities. 6 of the 48 are set apart as cities of refuge. I don't know how easy that is to see. I circled those cities so you have some idea, okay, and how they are spread apart. Intentionally, the goal is from north to south and east to west for these cities to be spread apart in such a way that wherever you live in the Promised Land, wherever you are in Israel, you can get within a relatively short distance to one of them. Now, I say relatively. You see, I don't know if you can see or not, the bottom there of the screen, you see the scale. It goes from 0 to 50 miles, okay? Now, as the crow flies, whatever, that would be fairly difficult, 50 miles in the desert. Even more difficult because of the terrain, the topography. But still, the reality is that there is the possibility of getting to one of those cities as you need to. Now, the cities are listed in our text, at the bottom of our text this morning. We're just going to read chapter 21 through 6 for this morning, but you see the names of the cities, and now you see where it is that they exist. So let's read the first 6 verses of chapter 20. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Say to the people of Israel, appoint the cities of refuge, of which I spoke to you through Moses, that the manslayer who strikes any person without intent or unknowingly may flee there. They shall be for you a refuge from the avenger of blood. He shall flee to one of these cities and shall stand at the entrance of the gate of the city and explain his case to the elders of that city. Then they shall take him into the city and give him a place, and he shall remain with them. And if the avenger of blood pursues him, they shall not give up the manslayer into his hand, because he struck his neighbor unknowingly and did not hate him in the past. And he shall remain in that city until he has stood before the congregation for judgment, until the death of him who is high priest at the time. Then the manslayer may return to his own town and his own home, to the town from which he fled." Now, if you've never read that chapter before, never studied the book of Joshua, it's going to sound very foreign. So what we need to do here, and the next step, is understand why these cities are so important and why they are so unique in ancient times. The Lord provides a safe place or a refuge in the law because of the avenger. And the law, the Old Testament law, original Testament, acknowledges that there is a difference between, on the one hand, intentional killing, taking of life, a murder, not war-related, that's a different word, but the intentional, thought through in advance, taking an actual weapon and going against somebody to take their life. There is a difference between intentional, thoughtful killing and unintentional killing. Something that could happen by accident, out working in the field with oxen, heavy stones that you're moving. There's all sorts of really terrible things that could happen, and someone else is connected to the unintentional death of an individual. So God's law in Israel was put in place to enforce a practice to provide an opportunity for refuge for those who did not commit murder with intent, yet they were still part of the killing of someone that happened unknowingly without intent. You follow me so far? The law that God has provided for those individuals in that particular situation, which could happen and did happen, was unique for the people of the time, unique in their part of the world. But it doesn't end there. That was established so that that manslayer, the one that killed without intent, could have a place to be safe from who? So the ESV calls him the avenger. So literally the word is the blood redeemer. So why do we say that? Or why does it say that? So there is, it's worth pointing out, there is a connection to a different kind of redeemer in the original Testament. A few years ago, we went through the book of Ruth. And some of you, I know, were here for that. I'm sure you remember, you have all your notes, you remember all the details and the points of that. If you know anything about Ruth from the original Testament, you know that she was suddenly widowed. She had no children. She had no one to carry on and to help her out when she became older. That was a terrible place to be in as a widow during that time. You had no family, nowhere to go. Well, as it turns out in the story of Ruth, there was Boaz. Boaz turned out to be a distant relative, and he made a way, and there's a love story. It's a nice thing. You should go read it. You haven't read the book of Ruth, it all works out great. So Boaz becomes the kinsman redeemer. He steps up to make sure that there is a way of life for Ruth. Okay? He does that for her benefit. The same word literally appears here in the book of Joshua, but is used in an entirely different way. Now we have a blood redeemer. So previously, in the story of Ruth and Boaz, the kinsman redeemer steps forward to provide a way for life and a future. The blood redeemer is the exact opposite. He steps up because a loved one, a family member has been killed, and he is going to avenge the family because of the death. So you see, there's similarities in the sense that there is redemption going on, but one brings life and the other brings death. And there is the allowance for that kind of an avenging activity to happen in ancient times. So with that being the case in the culture, the Lord provides a way for someone who killed without intent to escape the avenger. Why is that so important? Because the avenger doesn't care if it was intended or not, right? My loved one, my family member, is now dead, and I'm going to take anybody out who had anything to do with that. That's what's going to happen in an ancient culture, and that happens today. It happens all around the world still. I don't care how you did it, and I'm going to come get you. Now, that's the reality of this situation that is unfolding, and why it would be so necessary for that person that was actually responsible to find refuge. They would be quite literally running for their life towards one of those cities of refuge to get in and find safety. Now, like I said earlier, this is a whole different thing in ancient times. It was common for the avenger to go and seek blood revenge. It was not common, in any sense of the word, for a society to set apart places where you could go and find safety. The Lord takes the law even a step further. Because it's one thing to say, oh, that's nice, right? A person of Israel, a child of Yahweh, could go and find safety, and it was an unintentional murder. That's great. But in the text, we read that the law takes it even farther than that. In verse 9, cities of refuge were for people of Israel and for the stranger sojourning among them, that anyone who killed without intent could flee there. Now think about the implications of that. They are not part of the nation. In other nations and other places and people groups, they would have no recourse. They would be goners. If that avenger knew what he was doing, they would take them out, right? You can only run for so long, and then there's no place to hide. But the law provides for everyone, regardless of your ethnicity and your background or where you're from or who you know. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Sojourner or part of the nation, all are meant to be able to take advantage of this system. And as far as I know, as far as I've studied, and what I've discovered, there is not a nation in the world in ancient times that did that. Because who cares? They're sojourners. They're people wandering through the land at the time. Why would anyone care for them? God cares. And he's the one that matters in the establishment of this law. And because he cares, the Levites are to care, and because the Levites are to care, those elders in those cities of refuge are to care. So when the person running for his or her life comes to the gate, they will let them in the gate. They will ask questions for sure. They can't make a judgment yet because they don't know who this person is, most likely, right? So they are to take them in based on what? On their word in the moment. They could look sketchy. They could be a foreigner. Maybe they know that person and don't want him in. There could be a list of reasons, right? Why not to let this person running for their life in and provide them safety? It's an inconvenience. We don't have room for you right now. Go to the other place. Sorry. So not so sorry. They could say all sorts of things. But the law says you can't do any of that. No matter what they are, who they are, where they're from, what they say happened, you let them in. That's the law. So that brings us up to where I wanted to be at this point, to consider more about these cities of refuge. Joshua tells us a little bit, the book of Numbers tells us a little bit more. In addition to what I've already mentioned, extra biblical sources say this about those cities. They're supposed to be located in a way that's easy to reach. The roads were kept in good repair, or they were supposed to be kept in good repair, with signs placed at crossroads to make it as easy as possible, right? If the road, a storm, whatever, a rock fall, you name it, all sorts of things happen to roads, especially in ancient times. Those from the city of refuge were supposed to repair them to make it as easy as possible to get to that city. The gates were to not be locked. So if you run in a panic for your life to get to the door and the door is locked, that's kind of bad for you, right? So you're supposed to be able to get into the city. The cities were supposed to be prepared to provide food, not just shelter for these people. And the elders, like I said, were supposed to be ready to welcome and bring somebody in, no matter what the story, no matter what they look like, so that later they could sit down and actually review the case in a very official and formal and even legal way. So also remember this, the capital punishment, according to the original Testament law, had to have at least 2 witnesses, not just one. So the avenger could show up and make up a story, right? But too bad, if they're following the statute as it's laid out, there's got to be at least one more person, because we're talking about the life of an individual. There has to be 2 different witnesses regarding a case of murder. And then we have this other detail. When the high priest dies, then the manslayer, the one who is there seeking refuge, may return to his own home, verse 6. So the idea behind that, what does that mean? The idea behind that is they should be able to return safely. That whatever took place under the authority of the main priest, the high priest, whatever took place in the past, at that point when that priest dies, all is forgiven. That person should be able to walk out of the gates of that city and not fear for their life for the avenging family right around the corner waiting to take them out as soon as they walk out, okay? Because there's no guarantee for safety provided outside the city walls. That was the law. At that point, all is forgiven and forgotten, and we all move on with our lives. That's the idea here in Joshua chapter 20. So what I briefly, quickly described, different for ancient times, it's meant to ensure justice for everyone, and this, there's really no indication that they ever did it. What God's law, what God's standard was, and how it was actually applied, we know from original Testament narrative, the history books, and then what the prophets came and spoke about, we know that God's judgment on his people had everything to do with their lack of concern for justice. So what God laid out was there for the benefit of the people, was supposed to reflect his desire for justice to be known, was supposed to be a reflection of his character, and there's no sign that they ever actually did it. Now imagine that. If you were running for your life and you knew where the city was, something terrible happened, and you didn't get in. The old phrase, sucks to be you, right? A lack of justice and concern was what marked the people of Israel in an ongoing way. And that really is tragic, isn't it? To be running for your life and not have a refuge. That is typical in what we understand from what the prophets have told us about. So why is this important? These are Joshua's day. This is everything to do and has definite parallels with how we apply these things today. Two things that I'll wrap up with this morning. Number one, these cities of refuge show us what Jesus will do when he comes. Just like I told you, the law should be a reflection of God and his character and his nature. This is also a reflection pointing forward of the character and the nature of Christ and who he is. Who is Jesus? Jesus comes as the ultimate high priest. Jesus perfectly fulfills in his life and ministry, as he does his Father's will, he fulfills the role of the Levites and priests. Where they failed, Jesus didn't. Jesus is our ultimate high priest, our ultimate go-between, between us and God the Father. The writer of the book of Hebrews goes into detail explaining how Jesus is the ultimate high priest. He says this in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 18, and I think the writer in that chapter, what he's thinking about goes back to Joshua, because he says this, 6:18. We who have fled for refuge, might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. In other words, and he goes on, those who run to Jesus have a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. You know when you get to Jesus that you have a refuge that won't disappoint. All throughout the original Testament, everything disappointed. The lack of justice, where they were going as a group of people, a nation, everything was a disappointment. Jesus is different. Why? How do we know? Because Jesus isn't just another priest. The writer of Hebrews chapter 6, verse 20, goes on to say, Jesus is a forerunner. This is fascinating stuff. Take some time today, go back to Hebrews chapter 6. Jesus is a forerunner on our behalf. So interesting that it refers to Jesus as a runner. He's the forerunner. If there's somebody who ran, it's Jesus. He ran before us. Why? Jesus ran not because he was a manslayer. He's not running to a city of refuge. He ran because he offered himself to be slain by man. That's the point that's where Hebrews chapter 6 is going. Not the manslayer, the one who was slain. That's how he offers himself as the ultimate priest. We don't go through someone else, we go through Jesus himself. And he ran to his job as the one who would lay down his life for us so that we can run to him. He is our ultimate city of refuge. And actually, in a way we run to him, but physically, we don't have to run somewhere else because he's always available. We always can turn to him. We can always find him for refuge, for mercy, for forgiveness, to restore and renew life, and all these promises that are sure and true in the New Testament. We sang about a number of them this morning already. I hope that something in your heart is encouraged every time we sing about what Jesus does to intercede for us. He provides all of those things willingly and graciously without end. He does that for us as our high priest. He's sufficient for every need, no matter what your background, no matter what your sin is that you've committed. Christ is our only hope. Life is only found in him. And it gives me chills when I think about chapter 20, when the writer of Joshua speaks of the death of the high priest. What does that have to do with Jesus? Everything, and he didn't even know it when he wrote about the significance. Remember I said earlier, the manslayer has to stay in the city till the death of the high priest, and then supposedly he can go free and go safely back to his home, right, if he chooses to. And the avenger is no longer looking to save or to kill him, to take him out. So what does it have to do with Jesus? Everything. It was symbolic and meant to point us to Christ. Then the future of the manslayer was up in the air, right, until the death of the high priest, and then maybe it would work out. Now we understand Jesus' death as the doorway for all to enter through. Through death, he destroyed the one who has the power of death. That's comes straight from Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14. By the grace of God, the writer of Hebrews says, Jesus tasted death for everyone. Jesus died for us, so why? Just like in Joshua 20, we can go home. But this time we know there is no avenger. He's been taken out by Christ himself. Do you follow? Isn't that a beautiful pointer to who Jesus is? There is no fear. There is no fear. The high priest died so we can live, and now he stands living as the ultimate guarantee that we get to go home. No fear, no dread, no regret. Whatever has happened in your life, whether you think you were guilty or not, whether the roll says you were guilty. You get what I'm saying? Back then, it was the running for your life, and you were actually innocent. You weren't guilty. Everybody's guilty before a holy God. That's the difference here. And whoever flees to Jesus for redemption walks away safe and clean. I love this chapter. I love how it points us to the significance of what Jesus has done for us. The second one, cities of refuge are a forerunner to how gospel-centered churches should function today. What unifies us as a church? What brings us together? No matter where we live, what city, what county, what thing we got going on, or what our background or ethnicity is, or what our preferences are, what unifies us? Well, there's two things that should be involved in that unification, okay? Number one, we realize we're the church. Greek word is the ecclesia, okay? We're called out away from whatever we were. And the second thing is we're on mission for Christ, because just as we've been called out from whatever we were, Jesus says, you're called right back in. Therein lies the tension. Because most churches prefer one or the other. Most churches either kind of drift towards, I like being called out in a way, we'll just circle the wagons until he comes back. Okay? That's one extreme. And the other extreme is we're going to go, and lose track of what our identity is in Christ. Because you can be so involved in going out that you forget. So the tension lies somewhere in the middle. Who are we as a church? What unifies us? But here's one thing, in one way, that I think the church today ought to look like a city of refuge. No matter who comes in to the door, we let them in. I don't care where they're from, and you shouldn't either. I'm pointing my finger now, okay? What the background is, what the story is, what the complication is, what their hair looks like, if they have hair. Okay? Whatever. You get my drift, right? Now, everybody kind of agrees with that because that sounds like the right thing to say. The rub is in when it actually happens. And maybe there's some tension because of their background or the flag they're carrying or what it is that they talk about or whatever. If the cities of refuge are any place to start, it don't matter. We'll work out the details later. We'll talk about stuff later. Come in and find refuge, no matter what. That's the church. Whether it's easy or not, whether it's pleasant or not, whether they smell nice or not, doesn't matter. Now, what is even possibly more important today is that mission of going out. Because what we discover, what most churches discover is people aren't coming in the door. People aren't necessarily against the church. They don't see what the point of it is. So we've got to make sure people understand the point, that this is actually a place of refuge, that you can find rest and peace and comfort and love that goes beyond anything this world says it offers. This is unique. The city is a refuge. We're to be unique, the shining, beautiful example. We're a city on a hill, Matthew chapter 5. We are to be unique in this culture, in this world. People shouldn't be able to put us in a pigeonhole because they think they understand what evangelical means. No, we're different than whatever you